Welcome to GeekWire's Civic Conversation. I am reporter Mike Lewis. We've got I think, not only an interesting panel to talk to today, but we have it is as germane as any issue in Seattle right now. Joining us today are Tim Burgess, Rachel Smith, and Kieran Snyder. Tim Burgess is a former city council president, former interim mayor of Seattle. He served 10 years in City Hall as a member of the city council and spent a brief time as the city's 55th mayor. He was first elected citywide in 2007. Rachel Smith is the president and CEO of the Seattle Metropolitan Chamber of Commerce. She's recognized as one of the regional leaders for strategic approach in getting a variety of desired outcomes. Her strengths include her innovative problem solving, her ability to synthesize and communicate complicated information, and her experience navigating complex systems, which is exactly the definition of county government, where she served prior as the chief of staff for County Executive Dow Constantine. Kieran Snyder is the co-founder and CEO of Textio. Textio is an augmented writing platform. Virtually anything you write, Textio can tell you ahead of time who's going to respond based on the language that you've used. Textio's augmented writing engine is designed to attach to any large text with outcomes to find patterns for that work. Prior to founding Textio, she held product leadership roles at Microsoft and Amazon, which makes you about as deeply steeped in local tech as you can possibly be. Kieran, Tim, Rachel, thank you for joining us here on the Civic Conversation. And so the reason that we're talking to you, of course, is the Compassion Seattle initiative. That is going to be, I think, the leading political issue rolling into both council and mayoral elections this year. Before we get into the specifics of Compassion Seattle, it is a proscriptive amendment to the city charter that will essentially assign duties to the city on how to deal with the homelessness situation in Seattle. I want to back up just a little bit. I mean, the logical place to start with this for an explanation would be Tim Burgess, but I'm not going to start there. I'm actually going to start with Kieran Snyder. Kieran, before we get into the specifics of Compassion Seattle, can you tell us a little bit about, you're a Seattle CEO, you are a Seattle resident. From the outside looking in and very steeped in business in town, how do you see, as a person who lives here, how do you see the homelessness crisis in Seattle right now?
Well, it's definitely exacerbated during the pandemic. I think it's been a rising concern in most American cities, most cities in the West for the last decade. But I think it's really kind of gotten amplified and magnified during the pandemic, during social unrest of the last year. So, more as a resident than as a business leader. I do live in the city of Seattle. I have lived in the city of Seattle for almost 20 years. So I've been in several neighborhoods in the city and definitely have seen sort of homeless, houseless crisis on the rise and, adversely affecting the most disenfranchised people at the margins.
Right. So let me move then to, and that is exactly, I think that is a wide perception. That is exactly what I think Compassion Seattle, the charter amendment, is supposed to do. Tim, let's now swing it over to you. Tell us what this charter amendment is designed to do. And then also, as a subset to that, could you tell us why a charter amendment and what exactly a charter amendment is, as opposed to, your standard initiative or legislation?
Great, I'm happy to, and thanks for having us today. It's always good to have conversations around civic well-being, and this, as you've said, Mike, is a huge issue for Seattle and frankly for our entire region. Charter Amendment 29 creates, if adopted by the voters of Seattle, creates a compassionate, outcome-based plan of action for dealing with homelessness in our city, and primarily those living unsheltered in our parks, playfields, sidewalks across the city. At the last official count, which was in January of 2020, there's just over 3,700 of these individuals. They did not do the count this year because of COVID. So it's either the same or gone up. I don't think too many people think it's gone down in the number of people. So the major elements, if it's adopted, it requires the city government to invest more in behavioral health services, mental health, substance use disorder treatment services. It creates a behavioral health rapid response capability so that a team of mental health professionals and others can respond on some occasions in lieu of the police, who are not always the best response option. It creates 2,000 units of emergency housing within 12 months of the adoption of the measure. It waives permit fees and refunds a portion of the city's sales tax for expenditures creating those 2,000 units. And it affirms the city government's ability to keep our parks and public spaces clear of encampments. It requires an assessment of racial disproportionality among the homeless population, and that is a very significant issue in Seattle, and then to take steps to address that so that it is less of a problem. And finally, I'll just mention that it creates a dedicated fund in the city treasury to be used for human services investments, including those related to homelessness. And then finally, it expires in 6 years at the end of 2027. When we put the expiration clause in there, we kind of joked among ourselves, look, if this hasn't made a difference in 6 years, we need to get rid of it anyway and start something else. So we built in the 6-year sunset clause.
Hey, Rachel, let me ask you one quick question before we move on from that. You've spent a lot of time in government, both in City Hall and in the county, in the executive's office. When you see this sort of policy come through as a charter amendment, right? It not as regular legislation. In other words, it is essentially rewriting a portion of the city's constitution, if you will. How do you feel like that is from a policy standpoint? You're working inside government, not in your old role inside government. Do you welcome that, or do you resent that?
Yeah, I welcome it. And I think, there is sometimes this notion that the charter is an extremely sacrosanct document that should never be changed and sort of be codified forever as it is. That's actually not what we did at the county. We updated the charter every 10 years. I actually led the effort while I was the deputy executive to update the charter to sort of get with the times, to reflect things like, moving away from, sort of outdated language that's no longer appropriate. And we did that with great fanfare at the county. We would actually put together a large commission. That commission would meet for months and months. They would propose recommendations of changes to the charter to the county council, who would then choose to put those on the ballot and let them go to the voters. So I think for us, it was a very common thing, and feel good about it. I also think that when we're talking about this issue and sort of the state of this issue right now, using one of the strongest tools in the toolbox to really drive change is a good thing to do. So I support it both as a matter of policy and as a matter of governance. Okay,
now, so let me get back to Tim then, because I think I cut you off. You were jumping into something else. If we could talk for a moment. So you're in the process now of gathering signatures for Compassion Seattle. Is that correct?
Yes.
And where are we at right now with that?
So we just started last week. And by the way, if you would like to sign the petition, go to compassionseattle.org. The URL is right there behind me. We started last week. We were delayed in our ability to get started because there was a challenge to the ballot title that the city attorney had written. That was all finalized early last week, and then we were able to start gathering signatures. And we're doing that in various parts of the city. We started, as I said, last Thursday, and we've got until close to the end of June to collect the 33,060 signatures that are needed to qualify for the November ballot.
Okay, so so you expect then to get this qualified, I'm guessing. You folks seem to be pretty confident, since I've talked to you about this in the past. All right, so let's now we're going to get to questions in just a moment here, but I want to talk a little bit about some of the criticism of the movement of Compassion Seattle, the idea that it is essentially opening the door to a return to sweeps of encampments. It is effectively criminalizing homelessness in Seattle. and it doesn't have a good funding source other than just moving money from one pot to another within city government. Can you talk a little bit about those? Either Rachel, I know you're super familiar with it,
Yeah.
or Tim.
I'm happy to kick off, and then Tim, hand it over to you. You know, and I am not an expert in homelessness. I come most recently from government, and there I was not an expert at homelessness, but I have been around it a lot, and I've been around a lot of policy, and I've helped lead the county, and also work for other jurisdictions. So, you know, I've seen a lot of the work that has transpired over these many years, as has Tim Burgess. And I can tell you that when it comes to people living unsheltered in parks and on streets, just requiring someone to move with nowhere to go and no supports just moves them. It does just that. And so if you want to close encampments, you really have to do what works. And increasingly, we know what that is. It's doing the right kind of outreach. It's providing the right kinds of services, the right kinds of shelter. And when you do that, most people will come inside and encampments can be cleaned and closed. So this is a far cry from a return to anything that we've seen, you know, done with any regularity. You know, this is really keying off of what we know has been working lately. You know, we've seen the county has been moving people into hotels and providing services, programs like Just Care, run by the Public Defenders Association. Those are working, and those are getting folks to come inside by choice, and that's really the right thing. So I think it's totally inaccurate to call Compassion Seattle anything like sweeps.
And I would just add here, I agree with what Rachel just said. It's important for people to realize that this ballot measure was written by a fairly large group of people representing neighborhood leaders, business leaders, and the providers. Most of the city's major homeless service providers were sitting at the table, writing the language and commenting on the language. And we made lots of changes in order to satisfy the needs of this coalition that came together. And no one in that room favors just mindless sweeps and picking everybody up and sending them out of town or arresting them or whatever. This is not about this. This is about expanding behavioral health services, providing more emergency housing, and doing it in a way that has worked very well in other cities. In fact, we followed the protocols and recommendations of Community Solutions, which is a group that works with about 85 cities and counties around the United States on this issue. So it is not about sweeps. It's about helping people in a compassionate way, moving them inside, and then offering the services that they may need.
Kieran, from the outside looking in, how does all of so far, and I'm assuming that you actually are familiar with the amendment. At least I know that you've at least looked through it and read it. How does this make you? What do you think when you see this? Do you think that this is actually something that is necessary to move the bar in Seattle? Do you think Seattle's handling it fine as it is? What would you say?
Well, I don't think Seattle's handling it fine as it is. I think we probably can collectively look at the circumstances and so the sort of disparity, you know, Tim referred to it, I referred to it before, it's sort of adverse impact on residents from really the margins and underrepresented groups, the rise in overall homelessness over the last couple of years, especially the last year. I don't think we can say we're good. You know, we're not good to go as we are. So I would be surprised if anybody would assert that. I think the part that makes this interesting to me is the notion of investing in housing and support services that are independent of law enforcement. That's the thing that makes it a promising set of solutions. I think, you know, you asked the question about criminalization of homeless shelters and, you know, sort of living out in the open. And the only way the city has a chance to change people's habits there is to take approaches that are different than traditional law enforcement criminalization. I think we have to recognize that few people live in these circumstances by choice. Many of them need additional resources and support. And so the thing that makes the amendment interesting to me is the proposal of, reallocating resources to longer term solutions, like giving people a place to live, give them support around mental health that is not connected to criminality.
So let me go to some of the questions now that we've been getting in, and we have a lot of them. First off, and I think this would be for Tim, given that you are instrumental in helping to put this together, how would this be managed day to day? I think that if I understand the Charter Amendment correctly, one of the real focal points is that, yes, the city would be required to remove camps, but only after housing is available, and it would devote some money to that. Housing and services are actually available. Can you see, like, how would you've spent time obviously in city government, how would this on a day-to-day work differently than what's happening right now?
Well, there's a big shift coming toward the end of this year when Seattle moves all of its homeless services and personnel to the new regional homeless authority, which King County and Seattle and some of the suburban cities put together. This is a regional approach to the problem of homelessness, not just here in Seattle, but throughout King County. And so the Charter Amendment makes it very clear that all of the requirements of the Charter Amendment can be satisfied through the regional homeless authority, which Seattle will and is required in the amendment to continue to support, to invest in, and to cooperate with. So that's the primary way that it will happen. Now, the Charter Amendment doesn't let the city off the hook. If for some reason the Regional Homelessness Authority doesn't do one of the elements that's required, then the responsibility does fall back to the city government to do that. So let me give an example of how this might work. It calls for increased behavioral health services. The city of Seattle is not going to set up the structures and the protocols and the systems for those services because they already exist through King County. So Seattle will funnel funds to King County that will enable those services to be expanded to reach more people and to be more accessible to people who are living on the street.
But go ahead. No, go ahead.
I was just going to add, I think too, the Charter Amendment focuses a lot on outreach and the kind of outreach that should be done. And I think, again, that is based and rooted in what we know works from the service providers who are getting the outcomes that we want. And that outreach, again, on that day-to-day, it's really boots on the ground, people going out and working with individuals with their individual needs, ensuring that they're going to get what they need in terms of services, and then getting them into a more therapeutic environment than a mat on the floor. And that is really how you literally get people to agree to come inside, because that is better than being outside.
Yeah, let me push back a little bit on that, because I think what I'm really driving at here is the difference, of course, is that if there are services available and if there is housing available, it mandates the city clear encampments. Does it not? Or am I incorrect?
It gives the city three methods to close encampments. The first and the most appropriate is this person-centered outreach by name service plans for each individual, where we are encouraging, nurturing, nudging these individuals to say yes to services. And when that happens, then that encampment can be closed and cleaned up. The city, as it has today, still retains its ability to close encampments that pose a public health or public safety risk. The city does that today occasionally. They'll still have that authority under this Charter Amendment. But clearly the primary method, and what the Charter Amendment talks about mostly, is what Rachel just referred to. How do we do this outreach? How do we make sure it's culturally sensitive and competent? How do we make sure that we're addressing the racial disparities that we see? And how do we tailor these services to meet the needs of the individuals who are actually living in these encampments?
And I would add, for the way I sort of frame that is that it sets really clear conditions under which encampments should be closed. And also at the same time, there is no right for somebody to stay in a public place permanently. That is not a right that they would have. So I think it appropriately speaks to both of those things in the amendment language.
Karen, with this additional detail, what do you think? Do you think this is a good approach?
I'm thinking it through. I'm sympathetic to it. I think, as with most plans, the devil is in the details. What resources really will be available if we pass the amendment? What does outreach look like in actuality? What is the training of the staff that ends up doing the outreach? What kind of support do they have? So I think it's hard to, I know we do at the level of an amendment have to, I think it's hard to debate and discuss with some degree of abstraction there, because
Right.
you could imagine it going really well and providing, compassion, as the name suggests. And you could also imagine an under-resourced plan in reality with poorly trained staff that kind of went the other direction. So I'm still thinking it through. I'm sympathetic to the goals, and properly resourced, I see a lot of potential, what I would say.
All right.
And
Well,
Mike-
then let me. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry, Rachel.
I was just going to add, I think, and you talked a little bit about implementation, as did Kieran, and I think from the business community perspective, myself and John Scholes from DSA and others, we are committed to seeing this through implementation. We are investing in this because we believe it is the right, to the point, sort of 30,000 foot approach, and we need to get it right at every 1,000 foot underneath that. I also think you'll hear the business community talk about the need to consider the sort of expertise from people with lived experience, to be consulting with those providers who are getting the outcomes that we want to see today. And the business community will, as we do with all policy measures, sort of stick with it as we go and ensure that the intention that the charter amendment has is carried through every step of implementation.
Well, let's stick with that for a minute, since you roll now, obviously, with the Chamber of Commerce. Karen, you as well, given your role in your company, what is the business community's obligation here? I mean, some of what we're talking about here has been a long argument about payroll taxes and other ways of funding a city that has become unaffordable and not able to keep up with the services it would like to provide. What should the business community's role here be, other than advisory and helping to write a charter amendment, but should it also be financial?
I think it probably should. And I think there's a bunch of questions about which businesses and what makes you a Seattle business, what makes you a business in the region. I think about this really in an interesting way when I look at the journey we've been through at Textio over the last couple of years. We went from being completely co-located in a downtown office in Seattle to going remote, like so many businesses did in early March of 2020. And then we used the remote situation as an opportunity to hire in different markets, greater diversity of talent. And so today our company operates in 7 different states. We have team members in all North American time zones, including Hawaii, outside of North America, right? We have a pretty broadly distributed team, and we're not going back. We're not going back to having everybody in the same space in downtown Seattle. And we're thinking through what we're going to do for space, period, after 2021. Is this a situation where we're going to have hubs? Are we going to stay fully distributed? Are we going to have touchdown space variety? But we are still in all a company that is headquartered in Seattle. About 70% of our team lives in the greater Seattle area. About 40% of our team lives in the city of Seattle proper. So I think we probably do have some obligation via payroll taxes at a minimum to contribute and support initiatives that make the city better. I think that's part of what it means to do business in the city. I think, again, devil's in the details. How many employees do you need to have in the city in order to be a Seattle-based company? Is it really about where your corporate headquarters are? Is it about a concentration of employees? Is it about where your CEO happens to live and vote and represent in the community? There's a lot of ways it could go. And I think especially for technology companies, the landscape just doesn't look like it looked 2 or 3 years ago. There are fewer and fewer companies that are purely based in any one city, Seattle or anywhere else. And it makes it kind of complicated as a business leader.
Mike, I would just add that, from where we sit, taxes are not inherently bad, right? They pay for the stuff that we like in our community and that serve our community. They're also not inherently virtuous. We want taxes that actually fund the outcomes that we want in our community. And so I think, when you talk about the business community role, our role is to employ people. It's to provide paychecks for people to take home to their families. It's to add vibrancy, through small business storefronts and, large businesses, large employers that have work sites where lots of people come and create that kind of volume for the small businesses. It's to engage in civic activities like we are doing now that support our overall community values. It's to generate economic activity through commerce, and it's to pay taxes. So we do that. And also the business community has, a long and rich history of not just supporting campaigns for, different kinds of activities that we want to see in our community, but actually funding those campaigns, whether it's talking about transit or Harborview, which we did just recently, or just a couple of days ago, we endorsed the Best Starts for Kids measure at King County.
Well, Tim, then I guess it comes to you. How is this paid for? Right? Under the charter amendment, how does this actually get funded? Because there are no new taxes associated with this at this point, but that putting money in something means removing it from something else. Tim, I think you're muted.
My apologies.
No problem.
The charter amendment does, as I mentioned before, set up this human services fund, and it requires the city government to put 12% of its annual general fund money into that fund. Now, this year in 2021, 11% is going to that fund. If it was 12% this year, it would have added about $18 million to that fund, which in our conversations with behavioral health specialists is more than adequate to fund the expanded behavioral health services we're talking about. But then the question that you're asking, Mike, is, well, how do we pay for other things? Or how do we cover that 18 million, which is already in the city revenues? Well, this year, city revenues are estimated to run $40 million more than forecast. So the question becomes for city council and for the mayor, how are you going to use that additional $40 million? It should, in our opinion, be invested in the number one priority of the people of Seattle, which is to cure this homelessness problem, especially as it relates to unsheltered living in our public spaces. The city and county combined are going to receive over the next several months and into early next year, almost $800 million from the federal government through the American Rescue Act that was adopted by Congress and signed by President Biden a couple of months ago. Some of those funds could be used for these purposes. And then eventually, after the public's trust has been rebuilt in the government's ability to successfully address this issue, then maybe it would be appropriate to seek an alternative funding mechanism. But our polling showed that the people of Seattle have very little trust in the city government's ability to successfully address this. And so we did not go the route of new revenues. We just believe firmly that the existing revenues from increased income that the city is experiencing and the federal money can be applied to help get us started and addressing, especially if we're going to address the real root cause of homelessness in general, which is the housing supply crisis we're having. We clearly are going to have to identify additional sources of revenue.
And I would just add that, the Seattle's housing levy, I believe, is up next year. So we will be having that conversation as a community. And I know that everybody on this call will be participating in that. And also it is also about prioritization. What we are trying to say is that we and the voters, the business community and the voters, believe strongly that homelessness should be the top priority and that funding the right kinds of services and approaches should be the top priority. And government does that all the time. I just came from it, and it's about looking at the resources that you have and deciding what are the most important things, whether it's $5 million for ORCA passes for young people or legal defense funds for immigrant and refugees. All of these are important things. And also they're all exercises in prioritization. And so we want to sit with the city as they're making those decisions and encourage them to prioritize helping those who are most vulnerable in our community.
Well, this is an interesting area for me to just ask one quick question then of all three of you. I think the charter amendment has been described as essentially bypassing the city council and mayor's office and actually getting legislation, much like the initiative process does statewide. Is this a reflection that it's a charter amendment, a reflection of your level of trust in the city council and mayor's ability to solve this problem without having a policy change like this? And then I guess for Rachel and Karen, what's your level of trust in the city, in the mayor's office and the city council to solve this problem? Tim, you first.
So, this whole effort is forward looking. We're not interested in casting blame. We're not interested in evaluating or rating public officials. It's about a solution to the crisis we have of unsheltered living in our city. And this is a solid action plan that the city government and King County, because of the Regional Homelessness Authority, will be able to implement. And so I have confidence that if this is adopted by the people of Seattle in November, our elected officials will follow it. It'll be city law, so they'll have to, and we'll start to see progress.
Rachel?
Yeah, I agree with that, and would say that again, we keep talking about implementation, and both the city council and the mayor are going to be critical in that implementation and making sure that this gets implemented in the way that we want to see it as a community. So that's a very big, strong role for them that we want to work closely with them on. I think the other thing I would say is that this is really about focusing. It's about focusing our efforts. It is easy for things to get chaotic when you're, and trust me, I know, when you're working with complex problems. It's easy to see a whole slew of solutions and have people feel passionately about different ones. I think what we're trying to say here is that all of our effort, all of our resources, and all of our focus when it comes to chronically homeless individuals. Obviously, there's a lot of things that contribute to homelessness that we need to be addressing. But in this particular space, it's about focusing our energy and resources to what we know works. Again, we are seeing people, whether it's here in our community or around the country, who are taking this approach, and it is working. People are coming inside, they are getting back on their feet, they're getting back to their families. And this is a way to focus our community efforts and our city-led efforts at addressing the issue in a way that we know works.
Karen, what do you think?
I mean, sometimes if you have a really big and slow-moving river, the way to help it go faster is to feed it from a tributary on the side. I mean, I think of this as actually pretty analogous to what entrepreneurship is about. I think of it, I am not a public servant. I am a technologist and formerly an academic, so I come from very different worlds, but I see this as pretty analogous to what entrepreneurship does within the public sector, which is you have a really focused set of goals and issue that you believe is important, and you have the opportunity to focus the conversation, bring a level of clarity to a dedicated project that helps speed the whole thing along in a way that it might not hit escape velocity without that, because the city government is properly concerned with a very broad spectrum of issues. This is certainly one really important issue. Maybe, as Tim says, it's the most important issue. I don't presume to know, but it's certainly one of them. But if you're the city council and you're the city government, you have all of the day-to-day work. So sometimes to get acceleration, you have to work in parallel, I think.
So,
and I love your river analogy. I think that is well said. I ran a business for 20 years, and one thing I learned is if something's not working, cut your losses fast. And I think we can all agree, in fact, Karen, you said this at the very beginning, we can all agree that for whatever reason, what's happening today on the streets of Seattle is not working. Therefore, we need a shift. We need to cut our losses and head in a new direction. And the charter amendment is built on the success of others. And after consulting with behavioral health specialists and with the city's largest homeless service providers, we came up with this charter amendment. We want to change what's happening today so we can be better and we can bring people inside and provide them with the services they need. I was speaking the other day in a forum and someone was challenging me and the charter amendment and criticizing it. And after they finished, I said, okay, what would you do? I have never heard an answer to that question yet. That no one else is sitting on the sidelines waiting to say, well, here's my plan, or here's plan Y and Z. We need to have a change. And this charter amendment provides the opportunity for the citizens, the registered voters of Seattle, to go to compassionseattle.org, download the petition, sign it, encourage your family members, neighbors, friends, colleagues to sign it as well, if they're registered Seattle voters. And we can force that change. And that's what we're trying to do.
And Tim, you put a good point on that. And so I'll put a finer point on it. Absent that change, we will have the status quo. We will have what we have today, absent a change in approach. And so that's why the chamber is supporting this.
You actually created a nice jumping off point for one of our listener questions, and it is involving what other cities have done something similar. In other words, rewritten a city charter, allocated a mandated portion of the budget toward these sort of services. Where else have you seen this done successfully or unsuccessfully?
I don't know of other cities that have modified their city charter specifically for these purposes. We all just voted last November on modifying the King County charter. As Rachel mentioned earlier, remember, we voted to have the sheriff be appointed instead of elected. We changed the scope of responsibilities for the sheriff's office and several other changes that were made. I think there were 5 or 6 different changes to the King County charter. So this idea that changing the charter is somehow violating, I don't know what, is really a red herring argument. It does not hold weight at the end of the day. If you read the Seattle City Charter today, you're going to read both broad policies, you're going to read statements about how the city is to be governed, and you're going to read specific language about forming special departments in the city and funding them and creating special funds. The Parks Fund is an example in the city charter. So nothing we're doing here is bizarre or strange as it relates to the city charter.
All right, then let me ask another question when it comes to, you mentioned in a forum that you had some pushback from people, and I've seen some of that on social media. I've seen some of that in various stories. I'm sure you've seen it as well. One of the questions I thought was an interesting one was a long Twitter feed from reporter Erica Barnett at Publicola. And she essentially made the argument or made the point that these folks who participated in writing it, from the nonprofits, the homeless nonprofits, Plymouth Housing would be a good example of that. United Way would be a good example of that, who participated in the creating of this thing, have not actually endorsed this thing. Can you explain what's going on with that?
Yeah, I'm happy to take a stab, Tim, and then you can jump in too. I mean, like most organizations, many organizations have a process to go through. The chamber had to do that as well. So we went through our endorsement process to formally endorse this. So I don't think that is indicative of where they may be once they go through their own processes and their own organizations, which I wouldn't pretend to know what those are for the different groups, but all of those organizations, I think, have made statements about how they informed the language here, and I think their own words are what we should lean on when we want to know how they think about this. And in all of those cases, they've talked eloquently about how they informed this, and they'll go through their own processes going forward for any endorsements or other ways that they want to participate. So I don't see it as anything very dramatic.
And not one of those nonprofit leaders has retracted the statements they made, talking about the charter amendment, how it's a good thing, why we should do it, how they participated. Not one has withdrawn that statement. So again, I read Erica's piece. It's interesting, but that's not our focus. Our focus is the 3,738 people at last count living unsheltered in our parks, on our sidewalks. They deserve to be treated better by the citizens and the government of Seattle. They deserve to be inside. They deserve to receive the services that they may need, mental health services, addiction services, whatever it is. And they deserve to be treated with dignity and respect. And that's exactly what this charter amendment does. And so when you hear someone criticizing it for whatever reason, just ask them the same question I ask. Your plan. What are you going to do to solve this problem? We've stepped up and said, this is our plan. And we're giving the voters of Seattle an opportunity to say yes or no, if we get the signatures we need on the petition. So go to compassionseattle.org, download the petition, print it out, and sign.
I'll cue off you, Tim. And you can also go to compassionseattle.org if you want to be a part of the tent, right? Be a part of the coalition. I mean, Tim made this comment earlier, we sort of focused on the service providers, but there's a lot of folks that are a part of this coalition who come from different walks, who have differing opinions on certain things, but who agree this is the right approach. So would encourage folks who want to get involved in that way, want to be a part of that coalition or learn more to do that, because it is a diverse and broad group of people that are coming together to talk about this issue.
Karen, putting on your Seattle resident hat, how important is this issue when you make your determinations on who you're going to vote for? Not necessarily Compassion Seattle. I mean, I think I've got pretty good information that Tim and Rachel support it. I imagine that you are probably reading through it and doing your due diligence to decide how you feel about this. But just broadly speaking, the issue of homelessness in Seattle, when you go to your Seattle resident, when you go to vote for your district council person, or when you go to vote for a mayor, where would you rank this particular issue?
It's in the top few. I don't know that for me personally as a Seattle resident, it's the top and prevailing thing that would swing my personal vote only one way or the other, but I'd say it's in the top few. I mean, I certainly think the use of public space and sort of broadly speaking, how we think about space in our landscape and our landscape architecture and the set of related issues around homelessness, occupation, traffic, cost of housing. Like there's a set of pieces here that are all pretty intertwined. I think when you start pulling the thread, you get a bunch of other threads connected to them. And I'd say the whole cluster of stuff feels very important to me because it changes what it feels like to live in the city, changes what it feels like for my kids to grow up in the city. You know, I did not grow up in Seattle, but sort of been here about 20 years, but I now am in the interesting position of having children who are from here and who have only lived here and who are growing up here. And so I think about this as a place that my family has put down substantial roots, and trying to think ahead to what the city is going to be like when they become adults. Should they choose to stay? Should they choose to go elsewhere in the country? But to the cluster of things about how we handle space, population density, traffic, use of public space is all pretty important to me.
All right, so one of the questions actually in several different forms that has popped up is regarding the funding, not of the services element, but of the actual housing element. Can someone speak to what sort of housing are we talking about? Congregate housing, tiny homes, all of the above? And then is there sufficient money in the system right now to be able to actually fund housing at a level that can give the city the alternative of deciding to remove encampments from an area and put people into actual housing?
The charter amendment requires the production of 2,000 units of emergency housing within 12 months of the measure being adopted. So basically by the end of 2022, these 2,000 units have to be made available. It's actually more specific than that. 1,000 units in the first 6 months, another 1,000 in the second 6 months. The housing is defined in the charter as to what type of housing it will be. The phrase emergency housing includes enhanced shelter spaces, and the enhanced shelters are semi-private areas for each individual with lockable storage, 24/7 access, they can come and go, and services on site, case management, housing navigation. Rachel and I just toured a couple of weeks ago a huge enhanced shelter down in the Soto area of Seattle, south of Pioneer Square, that's both county and city funded and run by the Salvation Army. It was amazing, clean, efficient. People were there, I'm sure, much better than if they were sleeping in a tent outside in some park or next to the freeway somewhere. So the housing can include enhanced shelter. It can include tiny homes. It can include rented or purchased hotel, motel rooms, or any other form of temporary housing. It says that it could also be permanent housing, but we know that that can't be provided in 12 months. Those projects usually take anywhere from 2 to 5 years to implement and to complete construction before they're ready for occupancy. So these 2,000 units, I'd say 99.5% of them are going to be emergency housing, short-term, until we can move people into permanent housing.
And I just would add, again, we're seeing it done, right? I mean, when I worked at the county, we got involved in hotels for individuals experiencing homelessness, and we leased them and we moved folks into them, and they're doing better as a result of that. And that was a couple of month activity, not a couple of year activity. When you look at LA, they're doing something similar with like 6,000 hotel units. Councilmember Andrew Lewis has put forward some tiny home approaches. So it is all of the above. And I think simply saying we have to wait 3 to 5 years for X, whatever X is unacceptable to the individuals who are experiencing homelessness on the streets right now. So does this need to be an all hands on deck exercise where the resources and the activities of the city focus on either the acquisition or the other provision of these units for getting folks inside? Yes, it does.
Well, let me ask you this then. How do you measure in this? Let's just say that the initiative passes. How do you measure success? Several people have written questions, varying forms of big companies. I'm sure Kieran's company does this as well. They have criteria by which this was a successful program, this is not a successful program. Nonprofits, I think to some degree, struggle with that. Many have those sort of measures, but you're dealing with problems that are not something you got into business to do necessarily. And so tell me a little bit about how you measure this. And I would really like to hear your thoughts about this as well. After Tim and Rachel talk, I'd like to hear your thoughts about it as well, Kieran.
So the charter amendment sets a very specific goal, and that is to end chronic homelessness, especially among the unsheltered population. That'll be a priority focus. The charter amendment requires the setting of specific measurable outcomes. We don't actually set those outcomes in the charter amendment. We leave that to the government officials who will implement it, but they are required. And it requires that the city report on a quarterly basis how those outcomes are being achieved. One of the most important elements of solving this problem is to collect the right data, to analyze, and to report. The cities that have been successful have adopted these, what are referred to as by name lists and service plans for each of those individuals. This charter amendment talks about doing that, customized service plans for each person. So it's all there. We know that accountability is important. We saw the very low scores that the voters of Seattle have on trust and accountability with the current city council. We're trying to change that. And the charter amendment puts forth the goal and then measurable outcomes that need to be set and reported on an ongoing basis.
And I would just add to that, I think, again, this gets into that implementation space and saying, you know, that community leaders, whether they're business leaders or service providers or others, need to stay engaged and need to, you know, and it's hold accountable, but it's really like for all of our collective success here. It's not a finger wagging hold accountable. It is an embracing that we need change hold accountable. And we've got to do that for the long haul. So again, that's why staying engaged through all of the implementation is going to be critical for all of our community leaders.
Karen, what do you think?
I think there's probably a couple of pieces depending on the time horizon. So again, I don't have experience in the public sector, so take this as a private citizen, business leader point of view. I think for me, I'd want to see that a year out, 2 years out, the time horizon's probably somewhere in there. The circumstances look materially different. So like, let's actually, we're accepting that it doesn't work right now. So does it look materially different? And I think that has two dimensions. I think that has the dimensions of what's happened for the currently homeless individuals. You know, where are they? Are they living in a shelter? Are they able to be employed? Have they left the area entirely to live in public spaces elsewhere? I think there's the individuals. And then there's the experience of other residents in the city. And are you seeing business return, pedestrian traffic return to areas where you haven't seen it before? So I think that's the longer term time horizon. Short term, I think it's what Tim said. I think you'd want to create an accountability plan that 3 months in, are you collecting the right data? Like, do you have accountability around the data collection piece itself so that you're in a position to do more than anecdotal evaluation a year or two later? I'm sure that does involve looking at plans on a per individual basis, but it also could look at plans on a per neighborhood basis, you know, taking sort of the macro view about the impact to different areas of downtown. You know, Pioneer Square and Belltown may be very different in how they pattern, for instance. So I think the long term, you'd want to look both at individual impact and collective impact. And then I think short term, it's really the data collection plan that you look for.
I totally agree with that. Well said. And just to sort of pile on there, I think, you know, the measures need to be not just in sort of dollars spent and taxes raised, but in the change in experience. And I think Kieran, you said that just right on.
All right, so we're almost ready to wrap up here in just another minute. I was remiss in not thanking Microsoft for sponsoring the Civic Conversation. We really, really appreciate it. And thank you folks for joining us. And one more quick round of questions. We've gotten so many questions. In fact, I'm probably going to maybe put some of these together and ask you all individually via email. But how do you feel that, what is the alternative if this doesn't pass? What else is out there that you think right now is working? And what do you think is going to happen if Compassion Seattle doesn't move through?
Well, I'm happy to start and say that this is the right approach. I believe that absolutely, in terms of sort of the big picture, how we support individuals experiencing homelessness and move them out of homelessness. So we'll keep talking about this, and we'll keep working with our civic leaders, and we'll keep working with our elected leaders to continue to do this work. And also, I think it's going to pass. So I think we'll be okay.
I agree. I think it's going to pass. Our polling certainly shows it will pass, maybe even overwhelmingly. It's important that it passes so that our elected leaders in the city and in the county and the new leadership of the Regional Homelessness Authority understand that the people want to see action. And they want to see action that is founded in what's best to serve the individuals living unsheltered in our city. They want a compassionate response. They want the accountability. They want to see that their tax dollars are being spent wisely. And it's critically important for downtown, but also our neighborhood business districts, for retail, for the shop owners, for the hospitality industry, hotels, restaurants, for the tourism industry. If we don't solve this problem of unsheltered living in our city, it's going to be an anchor that holds us back from the kind of economic recovery we would all like to see, and to make that recovery as inclusive as possible so everyone can participate in what's coming in the future, and the prosperity can be shared among all populations of our region. So I think it'll pass. I think it's a good solution. It's just a start. As I mentioned earlier, the root cause of most homelessness is the lack of affordable housing, and housing in general, both market rate and housing for lower income families. So we have a lot of business to do. The mayor of San Francisco just announced, I believe yesterday, a $2 billion plan to deal with the very same subject of unsheltered people living in that city. And she quite eloquently pointed out how that is a harm to the city and to the people of San Francisco, and especially to the people living unsheltered. And we have the capability here to do maybe even better than San Francisco. So we should get to it.
And Karen, last word goes to you.
So that's funny in the context of this conversation, as I feel like I've learned a lot through this hour. I don't know. I think conceptually the approach in the amendment isn't going away. And so if it doesn't pass, I imagine what we do is the work of civics, which is look at the specific reasons it didn't pass, unpack the pieces that people objected to, and put it back together again in a form that retains the fundamental premise. So I suspect it probably will pass too, from what I'm gathering. But if it doesn't, then I think you do the work to figure out the specific issues that were in the way, and you put it back together.
All right, then, folks, we have to wrap it up here. Thank you so much, Rachel, Tim, Karen, for joining us today on the Civic Conversation. And thank you everyone else who was listening. We really appreciate how engaged the GeekWire community is. And this is not going to be the last that we're covering this issue, but this is actually a good step forward in at least explaining it for folks so they can make their own decisions. Thank you all for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.